The biggest rivalry in chess is between the knight and the bishop. The bishop is a fast, long-range piece and loves open positions where it can travel across the board in a single move. The knight, on the other hand, is a slower, short-range piece, dancing between light and dark squares. Knights prefer closed positions, where they can maneuver around the board and find advanced squares where they can attack several targets at once. Let's take a look at some classic bishop versus knight battles. In this endgame position, material is equal, but the game itself is far from equal. In this closed position, white has several advanced pawns in black's territory, and black's bishop is passively sitting on c8, trying to help prevent white's advanced queenside pawns on a5 and b6 from advancing up the board. Notice that all of black's pawns are on light squares, which makes it difficult for the bishop to find an open diagonal to use. White's knight, on the other hand, can freely move around the board in this closed position, looking for advanced squares to target black's pieces. If you could put your knight anywhere, which square would you choose? Did you think about the d6 square, where it is anchored by the e5 pawn and can never be attacked by an enemy pawn? This is known as an outpost square, and notice that a knight on d6 would attack both the c8 bishop and the b7 pawn at the same time. You know where you want your knight to be. Now how do you get it there? White clears the path for the knight by playing c5. White only needs 2 moves to get to the dominating d6 square. Let's say black tries to advance the kingside pawn majority with h6. After knight to c4, g5, white can simply ignore black's slow plan on the kingside and play knight to d6, threatening to win the bishop. So after bishop to d7, knight takes b7, white will simply play knight d6 on the next turn, when white's queenside pawns will be unstoppable. Let's take a look at another example. In this position, black's bishop enjoys the long dark square diagonal h8 to a1. White's knight is passively placed on d1, and black can completely dominate the knight by protecting all of the squares the knight can use to move. Can you find the bishop move that completely paralyzes white's knight on d1? That's right, with bishop d4. Black's bishop imprisons the d1 knight, prepared to capture the knight if it ever moves. Notice that black has the simple plan of advancing the king up the board and capturing the a5 and b6 pawns, creating 2 passed pawns on the queenside. Black's bishop easily wins this battle against the knight. As we said before, open positions typically favor the bishop. In this position, both sides have passed pawns racing up the board. With black to move, black can promote first, but will rush to defeat after a2, h7, and a1 equals queen. Black promotes first, but the new queen is short-lived after h8 equals queen, skewering the king and the queen. Once the king moves, white captures black's queen. What should black have done instead? The bishop advantage in an open position is only a real advantage if you use it. In this position, black has the incredibly strong bishop to c2. It prevents white's pawns from advancing, and it also prevents white's knight from checking black's king. When there are pawns on 2 sides of the board, this is usually an advantage for the bishop because a bishop can control multiple sides of the board at once. By spending 1 move to eliminate white's counterplay, black is now easily winning after knight to g4 and a2. White plays knight to e3. White's knight desperately tries to eliminate the bishop in order to free the passed pawns. Black can simply ignore this threat and promote to a queen and win the game. But black can also play bishop to e4 check, moving away from the knight's attack and still preventing white's pawns from advancing. Black will promote on the next move and should win easily. Let's take a look at another position. When all of the pawns are on one side of the board, this usually favors the knight as the knight is a short-range piece and is most effective when it only has to control one area of the board. Black's pawn on c4 is the key target. If white's knight can fork both the king and c4 pawn, white will win the pawn, and with it, the game. How can white's knight safely travel to d6 and fork the king and c4 pawn? That's right, with knight e8. And after bishop e2, knight d6 check, white forks the king and c4 pawn, forcing the black king to move away its protection of the c4 pawn. After king b6, knight takes c4 check, white creates a passed pawn and will likely pick up black's last pawn on b3 with a winning game. Let's take a look at another position. In a bishop versus knight battle, it is important for the knight to find an active post where it can control multiple key squares. White plays knight to b4, with the plan of centralizing the knight on d5. When fighting against the knight, you should do your best to prevent it from finding good, advanced squares to land on, such as the d5 square. Can you see how you can prevent white's knight from becoming active? That's right, with e6. Now that the knight is denied access to advanced squares in black's territory, black's bishop on e5, enjoying the long diagonal, is the much better piece. After knight to d3, white hopes to trade the less effective knight for black's bishop, but is disappointed after bishop to d4. Black's bishop dominates the dark squares in white's territory, which gives black the better game. Let's take a look at a similar position, but with a couple of differences. Notice that black's pawn has moved to e5 and black's bishop is on g7. These two differences are enough to swing the bishop versus knight battle to white's advantage. Black's bishop is now passive, blocked behind the several pawns on dark squares. White's knight has the great outpost square d5 and leaps at the chance to move there with knight to b4. Black's best chance is to try and advance the h6 and g5 pawns up the board, taking more space and opening up some dark squares for black's passive bishop. A big mistake for black is to play a5. This move is a mistake, not only because it forces white to move the knight to a square where it wanted to go anyway, the d5 square. By moving the a6 pawn, notice the b5 square is a new outpost square that the knight can use later in the game. After knight to d5, the knight enjoys the d5 outpost square, where it controls several squares in black's territory, and it cannot be removed by any piece other than the more valuable rook. White's knight dominates black's bishop. Now that you've learned about the biggest rivalry on the chessboard, bishop versus knight, it's your turn to join the bishop versus knight battle.